So without any further ado, I'll hand over to Ed. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Natalie, and thanks to the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here. So just to start, well, I'm obviously going to be really focusing on the big political event of the year in Indonesia, the 5-yearly elections. And in some ways, I mean, I hate to say it in a way, that as we were leading into this election, in some ways it seemed like it was going to be a rather boring election. For one thing, it was a rematch. We had the same candidates from 5 years ago competing against each other. Moreover, the current incumbent, Joko Widodo, had been comfortably ahead in the polls for a long time, for years in fact. And indeed, the final result was pretty much in line with the expectation we had from those polls. So just for those, just to remind you, the candidates here were on the gentleman on the left, Prabowo Subianto, the losing candidate in 2014, and indeed the losing candidate this year, was in many ways is a classic sort of authoritarian populist political figure. A former military general from the late Suharto period, had a bad human rights record at that time, but has been consistently aiming to acquire the presidency over the last decade or two, and has been presenting himself as this classic sort of populist mode, condemning the corruption of Indonesia's political elite, saying that what ails Indonesia can only be solved by strong leadership, the sort of strong leadership that only he can offer, and so forth. The other thing to note, however, and of course Joko Widodo, a man who was really in many ways a product of Indonesia's post-Suharto political reforms, a directly elected mayor, first in the central Java city of Solo, then the governor of Jakarta before becoming Indonesia's president 5 years ago. A couple of small points to note about the direction of politics over the last 5 years, because this is both important parts of the political backdrop to the election this year, is that there have been a couple of really major developments in Indonesian politics over the last 5 years or so. One is a growing sense among many Indonesians, that the country is becoming more polarized on socio-religious lines. And the key event there was the downfall, the removal from office, and eventually the jailing of Jakarta's ethnically Chinese Christian governor, a man popularly known as Ahok, a couple of years ago. An event which triggered significant mobilizations by many Islamists in Indonesia, and caused a lot of concern on the part of many, especially non-Muslim minorities and other pluralists. The other development to note as being an important part of the backdrop of this election has been what many analysts have called a growing authoritarian turn in the direction of national politics under Joko Widodo, a man who, when he was elected, was considered by many to be a great hope for Indonesian democracy. In fact, has been willing to oversee a government which has used increasingly illegal and authoritarian measures against some of its opponents. We're not talking anything like Thailand, for instance. So I won't be singing a song to illustrate political development, and you wouldn't want me to anyway. But nevertheless, there has been this authoritarian turn. So just to give you the headline figures, so it was a rematch, and the results, in fact, weren't that much different, even though Jokowi had 5 years in incumbency. Last time around, it was about 47-53. This time, 44-56. So a very slight increase. Okay, the key points I'm gonna touch upon in this lecture. I'll start by describing a big gap between how Jokowi wanted to win the election and how he actually did. Talk about the chief change compared to, sorry, that's the typo, should be 2014. Increased polarization in geographic and socio-religious terms in terms of the voting patterns. Look at some of the factors driving these voting results, voting patterns, and then speculate upon whether we're really in a new phase of Indonesian political history, and then also to question some of the comments I'm making about the degree of polarization. So how Jokowi wanted to win. So he's very much a developmentalist political leader, and he's put a great deal of emphasis in his years in office on two things in particular. Firstly is economic development, especially infrastructure. It's been, really has put a great deal of emphasis on development of roads, new ports, new dams, and so on. But also a president who's put more emphasis, even than his predecessor, on social welfare. He's very well known for being associated with these various cards, which give Indonesian citizens, especially poor Indonesian citizens, access to health, education, and other services. So that was really how he wanted to win this election, by stressing his economic development and welfare credentials and achievements. And indeed, if you look at some of the polling results, so this is a poll taken from an exit poll run by the Indonesian Polling Institute, Indikator Politik Indonesia. So, and it's in Indonesian, I'll tell you what that means. So it's basically a poll on satisfaction with the performance of the president. And 27% of the population say they were very satisfied with his performance. 40% said they were quite satisfied. So in other words, 67% of the population saying that they were satisfied with how the president had been performing, and yet he only got 56% of the vote. So already we start to see that there's a gap between how the president wanted to win this election and perhaps how he really did so. The next clue comes from when we look at some of the maps showing the distribution of votes. And these are maps which will very much remind people who are aware of Indonesia's modern political history of historic voting patterns in Indonesia. In particular, the patterns produced way back in Indonesia's first ever democratic elections in the 1950s, in 1955, when there was a really major regional divide in how many Indonesians voted. With many of the so-called outer islands, so in the majority Muslim parts of Indonesia outside of Java, voting for Masyumi at that time, which was Indonesia's major Islamist party. Whereas in the Javanese, the ethnic Javanese heartland, so in the east and the west of the island of Java, where many so-called syncretist or traditionalist Muslims live, plus in majority minority parts of Indonesia, so in parts of Indonesia which are mostly inhabited by Christians, Hindus such as Bali and other religious minorities, mostly voting for either traditionalist Islamic parties or for the secularists. Secularist or nationalist parties of various sorts. And we see this very much being reproduced this time around. So you can see that the red areas where Jokowi won were again in that ethnically Javanese heartland and in majority minority parts of Indonesia, whereas the blue parts won by Prabowo were mostly in majority Muslim areas outside of Java. So what's going on here? So let's start to have and just one. In fact, to further emphasize this, again, you don't have to pay too much attention to the Indonesian language text there. But what this poll shows, it's not an entirely accurate poll because it's based on quick counts, so the actual figures will change a lot. But what this shows is the light blue bars are the results for Jokowi in 2014, and the dark blue bars are the results that he got in those provinces in 2019. So what it shows, if you look at the left-hand side of the graph, it shows that the areas that Jokowi won in 2014, he won even more convincingly in 2019, and vice versa. So the areas that he tended to lose in 2014, he lost more spectacularly in 2019. So in other words, there's been a polarization in voting patterns over a period of 5 years. There's a few provinces you can see that he lost, that he won in 2014, he lost in 2019. We can come back to that in discussion if we have time for it. This is another exit poll. Now we start to really get into the nuts and bolts of what happened in this election. So again, another exit poll taken by Indikator Politik Indonesia on voting day. A couple of things here to draw your attention to. First, on the left-hand side, is incredibly spectacular result. 97% of non-Muslim respondents saying they voted for Jokowi. I mean, that is a concentration of voting along socio-religious lines, which is actually very rare internationally in terms of voting results. So an overwhelming victory on the part of by Jokowi amongst non-Muslim voters. And you can see, at least according to this exit poll, that there's a slight edge. Prabowo had a slight edge amongst the Muslims. However, if you look at the right-hand side of the screen, this is also very important. And it begins to indicate as well that this election involves not merely or even primarily polarization between Muslims and non-Muslims, but also a measure of polarization among Indonesian Muslims. And in particular, I want to draw your attention to the bars there for NU. So that's the Indonesian traditionalist organization, Nahdlatul Ulama. And you can see there that Jokowi won 56 to 44 in that population, whereas he lost in the votes amongst Indonesian Muslims who support other major Indonesian Islamic organizations. This is really important, and his winning margin, Jokowi's winning margin, can actually be found in this figure alone. Go back to the last election, you look at exit polls. At that time, actually Prabowo won a very narrow victory amongst NU voters. Why is this so important? Because a huge number of Indonesians are affiliated with Nahdlatul Ulama. And so this is, again, it's from the same poll, and it's just asking people, forget the exact wording, do you feel a member of one of these organizations? So this doesn't mean that you're formally affiliated, you don't have a membership card, but do you feel that you're part of one of these organizations? And you can see that 53% of Indonesian Muslims said that they feel that they're part of NU. So when you remember that the population of Indonesia is about 88% Muslim, you can see that this is a huge voting bloc. And you break down that shift of votes from Prabowo to Jokowi between these two elections among NU voters, and basically you there have an explanation for Jokowi's victory. I want to just explain a little bit about Nahdlatul Ulama for people who may be unfamiliar with the organization. So Nahdlatul Ulama is an organization. It does have support in various parts of Indonesia, but it's especially strong in those two critical provinces of Central and East Java. And it's usually referred to as a traditionalist organization. So it's an organization which puts a great deal of emphasis on the scholarly authority of the religious scholars, or kiai, or ulama they're sometimes called, based on this traditional organization of Indonesia, of Islamic boarding schools, especially in rural parts of Indonesia, especially Java. And importantly, although many members and supporters and leaders and kiai from Nahdlatul Ulama are quite socially conservative, quite even religiously conservative on many topics, NU is generally also very tolerant of all sorts of religious practices that are often considered to be heterodox by many other Muslims. So, for example, it's a major religious ritual associated with supporters of Nahdlatul Ulama is to pray at the tombs of saints in the hopes that these saints will intercede on your behalf or that you'll get blessings as a result. And there are many other sort of traditional practices that Nahdlatul Ulama people will engage in, which are considered bid'ah, or irreligious innovations by supporters of many other so-called modernist organizations, including the organization Muhammadiyah, which we saw in the previous slide. Supporters mostly voted for Prabowo. So there is this long-standing division in Indonesian Islam so these are religiously pious people, very strong Muslims, for example, who generally pray 5 times a day, but engage in particular practices that other Muslim groups consider to be unacceptable. And this division in Indonesian Islam is one of the longest standing divisions there is in Indonesian politics. It's a very long standing and important cleavage. Now, I mentioned before that one of the major issues in Indonesian politics over the last 5 years has been this growing polarization on socio-religious issues. It's important to note here that in this polarization that happened around the time of the Ahok case, supporters of Nahdlatul Ulama generally aligned with the president and with supporters of pluralism in Indonesia. And you can see there's a connection there between Nahdlatul Ulama's engagement in these practices, which are often considered heterodox, the criticisms that they receive from many other modernists or Islamists for those practices, and their tendency to support pluralist political positions on many issues, even though the Kiai themselves are often conservative on various social issues. So sorry for that rather long background. So we start now to get a sense of why some of these voting patterns were so sharply polarized in this election. This photo, can anyone, I'm sure there are people who can tell me who this gentleman is. Habib Rizik. So Habib Rizik is a leader of a famous Islamist organization in Indonesia called the Front Pembela Islam, the Islamic Defenders Front. An organization that about 10, 15 years ago became very famous for doing things like organizing raids on bars, brothels, places like that, but became a critical actor in the movement to unseat Ahok, that Christian Chinese government of Jakarta. And the critical political development that happened in this election this year was that the groups who'd been aligned around that movement, the Islamists, the more modernist inclined Islamic organizations in Indonesia, such as people affiliated with Muhammadiyah, but also the more extremist groups like FPI or groups like Hizbut Tahrir Indonesia, which in fact has been banned by the government, aligned with Prabowo. So this photo was taken at Prabowo's last rally, which was held a couple of weeks out from the election in Jakarta. And Habib Rizik was beamed in from Saudi Arabia, giving a very fiery speech, urging everybody to vote for Prabowo. He's currently in exile in Saudi Arabia, having been alleged of exchanging pornographic WhatsApp images with. Anyway, it's a rather unsafe story. I don't need to go into the details. But in any case, the point is that I happened to attend this event, and it very much seemed like it was presented by many of those who were there as being a reunion of the so-called 212 movement, the people who had mobilized to unseat Ahok a couple of years ago. Saw many thousands of people there. I think I only saw one or two women, for example, who weren't wearing the headscarf. It was very different, in fact, from the way Prabowo's election had worked a couple of years earlier. So, on the other hand, and this consolidation of the Islamists, who include many of the traditional opponents of both minority groups, traditionalist Muslims, like those in NU, and pluralists in general, secularists and pluralists in general, caused or prompted, and in fact there's a sort of a feedback loop going on here, prompted consolidation on the part of groups who favour a more pluralistic Indonesia, including those from Nahdlatul Ulama. So one of the things I did in the lead up to the election was I spent a couple of weeks in Central and East Java, so these areas of Indonesia which are these base areas, traditional base areas of Nahdlatul Ulama, and I spoke to quite a few sort of low-level leaders of the organisation, and it was very clear that there was a sort of a process of ideological consolidation and hardening going on among supporters of this organisation. Now, I should say as well, of course, that in part of President Jokowi's attempts to respond to this mobilisation of the Islamists that occurred around the time of the defeat of Ahok and the jail of Ahok, is that he has really turned to Nahdlatul Ulama as a kind of counterbalance to these other Islamist groups. So Nahdlatul Ulama has been a major beneficiary of the patronage politics that have occurred in the final years of Jokowi's government. I think it's 7 ministers, for example, are affiliated with one way or another with Nahdlatul Ulama. Nahdlatul Ulama schools and pesantren and so on have been receiving a greatly increased, development funds, funds for education, health, and other sorts of programs. And it should be said that Nahdlatul Ulama also has a long-standing reputation for being, highly pragmatic. Some would say even opportunistic in its political behaviour. But the thing that really did surprise me when I talked to many of these NU people at the grassroots, or at least in various city branches, was how they were saying that their primary method of mobilising their following was in terms of promoting this process of, some of them called it ideological brainwashing amongst their supporters. I can slow down. So ideological hardening. So this sense amongst many of them, and there were some certain standard lines that I heard from many of them, which concerned both the direction Indonesia is going in as a whole, as well as threats to their own organisation and their own cultural base. So in terms of threats to Indonesia as a whole, many of them said that Indonesia itself, the idea of Pancasila, the so-called Pancasila 5 principles, the sort of pluralistic philosophical foundation of the Indonesian state, was under threat. The pluralism was under threat, but also that NU itself was under threat by the entry of various Salafi preachers and other Islamic groups which were threatening the authority of the Kiai at the grassroots. And that these groups like NU needed to consolidate, needed to fight back, and they were doing just that by promoting a strong vote for Jokowi, and of course Jokowi's running mate, Maruf Amin, who was himself the supreme leader of the organisation. So the question really is then, how do we locate this particular election in terms of long-run trends in Indonesian history? And it does seem to me that we have entered a distinctive and new political phase in post-Suharto period. The post-Suharto politics was very much characterised by a sort of an all-inclusiveness in political arrangements, really most clearly characterised or most clearly demonstrated during the presidency of this man, Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, SBY, between 2004 and 2014. SBY ran what were often referred to as Cabinet Pelangi, or rainbow cabinets, which were broadly inclusive cabinets which basically involved all of the major political parties, or at least all the major political parties that wanted to take part, and which sort of distributed patronage politics very broadly, right from the PKS party, so the nearest thing Indonesia has to a strongly Islamist party, right over to the more personalistic, pluralist and patronage-based parties. And it would make all sorts of policy concessions to all sorts of groups as well. So the critical feature of Indonesia's politics in that period then was a sort of a broad-based inclusion that, on the one hand, fostered patronage politics, because it was basically based on a patronage sharing model. Everyone gets their piece of the pie, so nobody has to fight over it. But on the other hand, also then helped to reduce political conflict, at least at the centre. And it seems to me that we are moving into a different period of Indonesian politics, where some of the older traditions of Indonesian politics, including polarisation along socio-religious lines, are becoming increasingly visible in the nation's politics once again. So that's one of the big picture. I mean, it's a real challenge for us as analysts how to think about this period. How deep is that polarisation, and how long-lasting is it? To what degree is it simply a product of particular institutional rules that Indonesia has adopted? For example, very hard to this time around to get more than 2 presidents on the ballot paper. Had there been more presidential candidates, perhaps we wouldn't have seen so much polarisation this time around. But also, it does seem that we are seeing reflected in national politics some of these longer-standing currents of Indonesian political history, but also we're starting to see some of the results of the more recent processes of Islamization that many people have been talking about over recent years. However, I just do want to end with one particular qualification to my argument, one caveat here, and that is that so far I've really just been talking about one aspect of the elections this year, namely the presidential election. It's the aspect of the elections most people are interested in, but nevertheless we've got to remember that this was also a major legislative election or parliamentary election in which candidates were running for many thousands of seats in provincial, district and national legislative assemblies around the country. And it was interesting to observe how very often, once you go down again, once you go to the grassroots, how these elections occurred on an entirely different logic. And the old politics of patronage politics and distributed politics was very much alive and well at the grassroots. Why do I have a picture of a lamppost, you may well ask? Well, this just happens to be, it's a picture of a lamppost from a village I visited in a district of Gunung Kidul, not far from Yogyakarta, where the candidate who won the largest vote in this particular village did so by providing lampposts for the village. And in this particular, most legislative candidates build their election campaigns by doing things like that. So by relying on locally rooted social networks of various sorts, which often have very little to do with party organisations, and by providing benefits, patronage benefits, either to communities, lampposts, drainage, tarmac for the roads, a new dome for the mosque, Bibles for the church, whatever it might be, but also often by providing payments to voters on an individual basis. The famous Serangan Fajar or Dawn Attack, as it's often known, and there was certainly still a great deal of that this time around. So the point is that we need to start thinking about Indonesian politics now at two levels. On the one hand, there was certainly a great deal of polarization on social media when people looked at the news about the presidential election on the television and so on, and people did feel very strongly about that issue. We see that in the results. But on the other hand, a lot of the political party candidates at the grassroots didn't want to involve themselves in that polarized presidential campaign. So, for example, I spoke also in this village to a candidate who was, in fact, he was in a neighbouring village, who was running for a seat in the district parliament, and he was from PAN. He was a candidate for the political party PAN, the National Mandate Party, a party that is strongly associated with the modernist organisation, modernist Islamic organisation, Muhammadiyah, which is the traditional main rival of Nahdlatul Ulama. Yet he was running in a place where almost everyone was affiliated to Nahdlatul Ulama. So I asked him, well, you know, your party is one of the really strong supporters of Prabowo Subianto. How does that go? Campaigning for Prabowo when you're organising your campaign in these Nahdlatul Ulama villages. He says, oh, I don't talk about him. You know, why would I do that? And the whole point was that he was entirely running to get support for PAN from these Nahdlatul Ulama voters, where his father was a major contractor in the district town, and so he had either in the past provided roads in those villages or was going to do so as part of his so-called political contracts with these researchers. With these, sorry. I think it's time to finish. So anyway, the point is that this is one of the challenges we're going to have to think about for Indonesian politics. Yes, on the one hand, there is this politics of socio-religious identity polarization, which is developing very markedly and very visibly. On the other hand, this is occurring within an institutional and political economy context, still very much conditioned by the politics of patronage.
Okay, just as well we gave you a bit of extra time, hey? So time for some questions. I can see one down the front here with AIM, and then just behind her, Dewi. Yeah.
Thanks, Ed. I have a question. So, Toyota Fortuner is pretty expensive. So is there a wealth component to the supporters of NU?
Is there a, well, I just missed the first
The
part.
SUV is pretty expensive.
Oh.
So you want to for
Oh, yeah,
dinner?
Yeah.
So I was just wondering.
the car, right?
The car.
Right.
It's like pretty high-end SUV.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering if supporters of the NU are like, is there a wealth component to that?
Yeah, so in general, NU people are rural people, and they generally have lower levels of education than the population as a whole. And so in general, when you're talking about NU masses, they tend to be on average rather poor. But it's a completely different thing when you come to the NU elite. So the Kiai, the families of the Kiai, and also other leaders of the organisation. Many of whom have property like sort of land, often associated with their pesantren, but also, especially in areas where the organisation has been politically strong and influential, in the last 20 years have been accumulate a lot of, how to put this, economic capital from the political capital that they are able to mobilise. So a lot of government funding from both the national, provincial and district levels in those strong NU areas has been flowing towards NU affiliated organisations now for quite a long time. So there is quite a stark wealth inequality within the NU community.
Thank you. Thanks for the presentation. Thanks for your lecture. So the polarization is very, very visible on social media. I'm doing research on that topic, and I've talked to a few people, to a few undergraduate students in Indonesia about that from my pilot project. They say although feasible, the polarization on social media did not do anything to their choice, because sort of like they've already got their choice, and whatever people say on social media doesn't mean that doesn't mean anything for them. What do you think about that? Like, does polarization on social media means something to the result of the election for this year?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of those tricky things that we need to grapple with, and no one's really got the right answer to it yet, right? Because there is this, extremely intense rhetoric on social media, often very hate-filled, very dramatic, a lot of, sort of the classic sort of thing we've become used to in the social media age, trolls, counter-trolls, cyber armies, very polarizing rhetoric and so on. And I think we can't say that this is ineffectual or is without an effect, because we can see that clearly there is something really going on here in the presidential elections. I suspect it's not simply about social media networking, but also about ordinary sort of day-to-day community level social networks as well. When you see the results for Prabowo are so strong in a province like West Sumatra, and likewise for Jokowi in a province like Bali, you can see that there must be a huge degree of social pressure and peer pressure partly contributing to these results as well. So I think somehow we have to develop a new model that keeps these two things in our mind at the same time. That yes, in that sort of social media world in which many Indonesians, not all, but many Indonesians participate, people are being exposed to and often participating in this very polarizing rhetoric, and yet at their community level, very often there isn't that degree of polarization. So again, the village I went to in Gunung Kidul on voting day, people were quite indifferent to a lot of the sort of the high-level dramas around the presidential election. So I don't quite know how to answer your question or respond to your comment, but I think that is one of our challenges, that there are different political trends happening in different parts of the political system at the same time.
Oh, sorry, one at the back and then
Hi Ed, thanks for the talk. I just wanted to ask, given the decentralisation of matrix policies and the fact that this is a rematch, to what extent do you think this election has been a means for genuine public participation in policy development and change?
So policy development. Look, I mean, I think I mean, I think that's the election that Jokowi would have liked to have had. And he, in a certain sense, he tried to have. You know, you look at the debates on the economic policy, look at the various social welfare programs and so on. But you just look at the results and how the results were sort of over-determined by socio-religious identities, and we just don't see a lot of evidence of those policy debates having cut through to a degree to which they'd be able to trump the identity alignments. So I guess that's my basic sort of response. But what was the other part of your question?
What about the level below that, at a regional level?
Right, so at the regional level, so the problem is at the regional level, the elections were parliamentary elections, right? And parliamentary candidates have very little ability to or interest in promoting policy change. Indonesian parliaments, especially at the provincial and district level, are really much more about budget formulation. They're about monitoring the policies and the development spending, really, of the district heads and the governors. And those elections take place almost entirely in a patronage mode. So it's almost entirely, there are candidates who try to speak about policy issues and promote themselves as being associated with particular policies about women's empowerment or whatever it might be. But very often the way that's translated into actual face-to-face interaction with voters is in terms of delivery of patronage, the sort of the club goods or the one-on-one payments I was talking about before. There's not a lot of policy debate, especially in the parliamentary elections.
Yeah, thank you. Some really insightful comments that I'll take back home there. Given that Maruf Amin got brought into the Jokowi camp and his controversy, especially on women's rights, I feel like one of the elephant in the room of these populist men and movements is their views on women. And I wondered how far, in your opinion, do you think anti-feminist attitudes help mobilise populist groups, if at all? And is there a recognition in the party rooms that gender issues help people both win and lose elections?
Right. Okay. So, yeah, I don't think so. There are obviously explicitly sort of anti-feminist movements in Indonesia, and there was one very good article in Mandala or Indonesia, Mandala, was it, on that. So if people haven't seen that, I would really recommend that article to you. But I don't think that was a really prominent part at the level of the presidential campaigns. At the level of parliamentary elections, it's a whole different story because there's such a multiplicity of candidates that you get candidates with all sorts of networks and positions running. So you do get a lot of female candidates who run, for example, trying to mobilise a women's vote. Often, for example, using social networks such as Fatayat or Muslimat, the women's organisations associated with NU, or many other sorts of organisations. And there's a quota system too in the parliamentary elections. And it's a huge area. So I am actually involved in a research project with colleagues from ANU and from Gajah Mada University in Indonesia looking at women candidates at the parliamentary elections. We're doing a workshop in about a month, and I did a whole bunch of interviews with female candidates, and you just get this incredible multiplicity of strategies. You know, women candidates who focus almost entirely on women's networks, raise women's issues, don't bother much about trying to mobilise male voters because they think male voters are too sexist. Versus women candidates who view that strategy as being completely stacked, right? So yeah, so I guess just watch this space. Hopefully we'll have a special issue of the channel out in about a year's time.
I think we have time for one last quick question. This side of the room, Ken, yeah?
Thanks, Ed. I sort of got resumed my previous question about decentralization, but I was just really curious because obviously there are many people in Malaysia who are looking after a year of so-called regime change and looking at the immediate aftermath of post-Orde Baru Indonesia and whether there are parallels about this rise of the polarization you're talking about that have been reflected in results and whether there's this stronger or need for a type of religious narrative to drive that national campaign versus that development agenda that you say has delivered for Jokowi so far, whether that's falling away. I mean, I thought it was fascinating looking at that map you showed of how Sumatra, for instance, is so divided from Aceh down. I was just curious to hear your views about the religious politics.
Right.
In 2 minutes.
Right. So as a comparison with Malaysia, right?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Well, I mean, two things. I mean, well, actually, I don't know how many things I want to say. I mean, there is an obvious parallel, right, in that religious identity in Indonesia, as in Malaysia, I guess. Malaysia is a bit more complicated because ethnicity is very important too in the national party system. But in Indonesia, attitudes towards religious or attitudes to the place that religion, i.e. Islam, should play in structuring public affairs is the major cleavage which organises the party system, right? So, for example, about a year or so ago, with a number of colleagues, including Eve Warburton sitting right there, we did a bunch of surveys of DPRD members, so members of provincial parliaments from all the major parties, asking them, where would you position your party on a left-right spectrum? Where would you position your party in terms of standing for the ordinary person versus standing for business? Where would you position your party on women's rights? Where would you, and a whole bunch of things. And in general, almost always, in response to those questions, the parties were all just clustered. Sometimes right in the middle, sometimes a bit towards the right, sometimes a bit towards the left. But they were just generally not differentiated. But we asked 2 questions about does your party stand for a greater role of Islam in public life? And there was another Islam-related question as well. And there the parties were really strung out along a spectrum. So in that degree, the Indonesian party system is significantly structured around religious identity in the way, and it has been actually, it just hasn't come to the fore in quite the same way because of that more all-inclusive pattern that we saw under SBY versus the more polarized pattern that we have now. So there is so there is that sort of historic similarity. I guess the question is, well, I won't even try to get into this, but why do we see similar trends versus divergences at particular points in Malaysian versus Indonesian history? I mean, obviously there's the whole Islamic revival question, the impact of social. You could do a book on that. I think several books.
Please join me in thanking Professor